When? Okay. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this informative and fascinating talk on Wellfleet's historic houses and the stories they tell. My name is Merrill Mead Fox, and I'm the co-chair with Gordon Kahn of the Wellfleet Historical Commission. We are delighted to present Lynn Smilidge, the historic preservation consultant who is contracted with the Wellfleet Historical Commission to research and document Wellfleet's historic houses and their inhabitants. Lynn has done an impressive job of updating over 140 inventories of Wellfleet's historic buildings, and she will be sharing some of her research with us today. She will also discuss architectural styles, clues on dating and categorizing buildings, and the role of the Wellfleet Historical Commission. Lynn has worked as a preservation planner for the city of Methuen and for Spencer, Sullivan, and Vogt Architects. She has served on the Historic District Commissions in Andover and Boston and has chaired the Boston Landmarks Commission for more than a decade. She's a guide for Boston by Foot and a docent at the Boston Athenaeum and the Paul Russell Museum of Medical History and Innovation. We're fortunate that she's working with the Wellfleet Historical Commission to preserve Wellfleet's history and that she's here today to talk with us about her work. The Wellfleet Historical Commission was established by town meeting vote in 1986 for the preservation of historic buildings which reflect the historical, cultural, or architectural heritage of the town of Wellfleet. The commission is responsible for reviewing plans for substantial alteration or demolition of historically significant buildings in the town of Wellfleet. We are also charged with researching and preparing inventory forms on historic properties in Wellfleet, and we contract with historic preservation consultants such as Lynn to do this work. We are sometimes confused with the Wellfleet Historical Society and Museum, which is a nonprofit organization organized in 1951 to collect and preserve the story of Wellfleet through exhibits, research archives, and community engagement. Both organizations work in different and complementary ways to preserve and protect the history of Wellfleet. It's important to acknowledge the work of Helen Purcell, who lived from 1919 to 2020, as we discuss historic preservation in Wellfleet. An educator who retired here to Wellfleet with her husband, Helen Purcell was a mainstay of the Wellfleet Historical Society, where she acted as curator of the Society Museum and organized annual Wellfleet house tours. She also completed numerous historic inventories of buildings in Wellfleet and documented Wellfleet's historic resources. Destruction of Barnstable County deed records by fire in 1827 meant that the precise dating of buildings and records of their inhabitants before that time were lost. Helen Purcell's inventories are invaluable since many of them contain marvelous oral histories that were passed down by Wellfleet residents. As we update Wellfleet's historic inventories, Helen Purcell's original work is preserved. The Wellfleet Historical Commission would like to express our gratitude to Lynn Smilidge for her work to preserve the history of Wellfleet's buildings and inhabitants, and to Wellfleet's Community Preservation Committee, which supports the updating of our historic inventories and this workshop through its grants to the Wellfleet Historical Commission. We also want to thank Cheryl Jaffe at the Wellfleet Historical Society and Museum and Jennifer Wertgen at the Wellfleet Library for storing copies of these historic inventories for public access and for helping with publicity for today's event. Finally, special thanks go to Jennifer Wertgen at the Wellfleet Library for hosting this wonderful Zoom presentation. This is truly a collaborative event. And now I am very happy to introduce Lynn Smilidge. Take it away, Lynn. I'm muting myself.
Thank you, Merrill. That was such a generous introduction. I really appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure working with the Wellfleet Historical Commission. And it was challenging because all the work was done during the pandemic. And so it was all virtual. And I'm just so happy to be able to attach some faces to names tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. I just have to get rid of this toolbar so I can operate the slideshow. All right. Oops. Sorry, I thought I had practiced this so many times.
Just hit escape.
Yep. Thank goodness for Jennifer. All right. And I need to share again, correct?
No, you're still sharing.
Share.
You're still sharing.
All right. I just don't see it. Well, my deepest apologies. I do see a message here. No, that's not helpful.
Yeah,
That looks promising. All right.
okay. And now go to slideshow across the top. It's like,
Yes. It's obscured. There we go. All right.
yes, that's what you want to do from the beginning. Exactly.
Thank you for saving me. And my apologies again. And I am going to, all right. Well, I'm delighted to be here, as I've said. The historic houses of Wellfleet and the stories they tell. This is what we're going to cover tonight. An evolution of kind of just a quick scan of Wellfleet's built environment, because Wellfleet's houses reflect the fortunes over time of the community. We're going to touch on Wellfleet architectural styles. I won't go into too much detail and so that your eyes glaze over, but I think a primer will be very helpful. We'll talk specifically about the survey project that we worked on, and then we'll look at some particular houses and buildings that have especially interesting stories attached to them. So Wellfleet's built environment, and here is a map from 1880 of Wellfleet. So just traveling a bit through time, pre-revolutionary years, Wellfleet, and many of you are probably much more well-versed in Wellfleet history than I am, but small fishing villages mostly, all clustered around harbors. The primary villages were South Wellfleet, Billingsgate, Griffiths Island, Boundbrook Island, and Duck Creek, aka Wellfleet Village. Each of these villages had about 20 to 30 families and businesses, schools, taverns, that was important, and churches. Most of these houses were modest, and they were almost entirely Cape style houses. And we'll talk definitely more about Cape houses, half capes and 3/4 capes. There's an example in the lower right of a half cape. So it's 3 bays wide with an entry door and 2 windows. Very small, but they grew over time. After the revolution, Wellfleet grew. Houses got larger, and we saw more full capes, and they had more stylish details. Their owners were a little more affluent. There's a full cape at the top of the screen, and you can see it looks a little jazzier than the one we saw in the last slide. It has more decorative detail around the door. We also began to see larger public and institutional buildings like the church at the bottom of the screen. Then in the 19th century, there was a boom. The local economy was healthy. Fishing, coasting, and coasting is, coasters were vessels that transported goods from one coastal community to another. And businesses that supported the maritime industry were flourishing. This is when the large commercial wharves were built. The outlying villages began to consolidate to the center of town, to Duck Creek. Main and commercial streets grew quickly and began to form a business center. New homes were built, and the residents were doing well. They were successful financially, and that was reflected in their houses, both size-wise and in terms of being fashionable and detailed, as the two that you see here, 2 Greek Revival houses. The Greek Revival style predominated during this time and actually continues to predominate in Wellfleet among the old housing stock. So this economic boom peaked by approximately 1870. And here's an example of what was happening on Commercial Street. There's an 1858 map on the left, and you can see the little dots, which were houses. I count about 5 houses on Commercial Street in 1858. By 1880, there are about 20 houses in that same stretch of the street. And then things began to go the other direction. The fishing industry waned. The railroad arrived. The railroad arrived in Wellfleet on December 28th, 1870. And that began to chip away at the maritime passenger and freight shipping industries. The population began to decline gradually. Fewer new buildings were built. Seamen, they left the sea. They sold or abandoned their homes sometimes. Some of them moved inland or to Boston to take on manufacturing jobs. However, there was some good news. The shellfish industry rejuvenated, and you can see some evidence of that in the postcard of the lower right. I don't know the date for that. And then the turn of the 20th century and the rise of tourism. Probably most of you here are familiar with Lorenzo Del Baker. He was a fascinating character, an important benefactor and philanthropist, very important to the fortunes of Wellfleet. A whole presentation could be devoted to him. Suffice it to say that he was a savvy businessman. He pretty much created the market for bananas in this country. And the company that he formed eventually became the United Fruit Company, which is still around. Lorenzo Del Baker was also very active in local real estate. He bought and sold lots of properties. I would have to say that of 150 properties that I did deed research for, Lorenzo Del Baker or his heirs or family probably owned the property, about 30 to 40% of the properties that I researched. His hand was really in the market. He also saw an opportunity in the tourist trade with the arrival of the railroad and built the first hotel in Wellfleet, the Chequesset Inn, which was built in 1886. And there's a lovely postcard of that in the upper right of the screen, followed by other tourist hotels. The image in the center, that large Second Empire mansion, was the Wellfleet Hotel. The building right beside it, to the right of the hotel, it was the Wellfleet Hotel Annex. And we'll have a little closer look at that building later in the presentation. So many houses were purchased as summer residences by out-of-towners. And then another thing that really put Wellfleet on the map, and this was later into the 20th century, was the mid-century modern houses, these vacation and summer homes that were built. The first one in 1938. As many of you probably know, Wellfleet is now a mecca for people coming to enjoy and appreciate these mid-century modern homes. So the architectural styles that we see in Wellfleet. I'm going to see if I can bring up a pointer. All right. But before we go much further, I just want to say a few words about architectural styles. The nomenclature is confusing and continues to change over time. The terminology is complicated. Italianate and Gothic revival styles, for instance, those are the terms we use to refer to them today. Earlier in the century, they were called picturesque. There are lots of contradictions. I think there are probably as many contradictions as there are rules in terms of describing architecture. It's important to understand too that architectural styles were first seen in urban areas. And it often took a while for them to work their way out to the hinterlands. So in 1860, a Greek revival house might have been passé in Boston, but in 1860 and beyond, lots of brand new Greek revival style houses were being built in Wellfleet and throughout the rest of New England. So all these styles, at least all the early styles that we're going to discuss today, are based on English precedents. Also important to note that style of a house offers lots of really important clues to determining the age of a house. However, you can be fooled. You really need more evidence to accurately date a house. You need to support it with deed research if that's available. As you just heard in Wellfleet, a lot of the early deeds were lost. Structural study is important, really important to look at the framework of the house, the timber work inside and details inside. Dendrochronology is occasionally used. Dendrochronology is carbon dating of timbers in a house, but even that can lead you astray because Yankee builders were very frugal and recycled materials. So you may well have a house that was built in 1800, that's when it was constructed, and yet it contains a lot of salvaged timber that might have been salvaged from a 1750 house. So there's a lot of sleuthing that needs to be done. So we'll start with capes. And the Cape style is synonymous with Cape Cod. It originated in Cape Cod around 1690 and saw continual use right through the middle of the 19th century for building new houses. It then came back again in the 20th century, along with the colonial revival. So Cape houses have always been popular. They were typically, Cape house is always a story and a half, and it's always side gabled. And I will just point out, this is a side gable, this side of the house. And this is the facade or the main elevation of the house. And this is described as a side gabled house. An end gabled house would have this end as the primary entry to the house. We'll see that with Greek revival houses. Cape Cod houses had steep roofs, sometimes bowed. I only saw one bowed roof in Wellfleet in the work that I did. They're quite unique now. The bows are very subtle, just a very subtle in the gable, like that. And sometimes you have to look really hard to realize that it's there. Window sash. Typically, the early capes would be 12/9 or 9/6, and that refers to the number of panes of glass divided by muntins in the top sash, and this is the number of panes of glass in the bottom sash. Glass was very expensive to produce. At this point, most of the glass that was used in New England houses was imported from England. It was expensive. The technology didn't allow the creation of glass in large sheets. So the size of a window pane or a light, as it's called, is a good clue to the age of a house. In these early capes, the windows touch the frieze board. So this is the frieze board right under the cornice. So they tended to abut right up against that. Early houses had narrow corner boards. This is a corner board. So these define the corners of a house. This area at the base is called a water table. The door surrounds were simple. This is a very simple entry surround, as is this. So this is a little bit more elegant because it's got a transom over the top of the door. The chimney was always centered on the entry. So this chimney, this is a 3/4 cape, 2 windows on one side, 1 on the other, and the chimney is centered right over the door. The same thing with this half cape. Chimney is right over the door. It aligns with the door. Closet windows are another sign of an earlier cape typically, and those are these little windows tucked right under the eaves. You often see them only on one side of the house, on one gable end, and they're typically denoted a closet. Then later capes, also 1.5 stories, side gabled, but as time passed, this 5-bay facade, so 2 bays on the right, a centered entry, and 2 bays on the left, that defines a full cape. The roofs became a little bit shallower. And then you started to see a knee wall. So you see in the last house that we looked at, the windows touch the frieze board right under the cornice. And now we have just a little more room here above the window. That's called a knee wall or a stud wall framing. So that the stud wall is extended a little further up. And that just bought a little more space in the half story above. Some of these knee walls are quite tall. We're starting to see more elaborate door surrounds with side lights. So these are side lights, rows of lights, a vertical panel of lights on either side of the door, and a transom. This is a more elegant transom. It's an elliptical transom above the door. Earlier capes tended to be mostly wood shingle. That was less expensive than clapboard. We begin to see clapboard, and often the clapboard was limited to the facade, to the main, the front of the house, because that was that's what was presented to the street. And so that's where you had your most expensive siding, and the less expensive siding, the shingles, wood shingles, used on the rest of the house. And again, the chimney centered on the ridge of the roof and always in alignment with the entry. This house dates to about 1820. And then the federal style, roughly 1780 to 1820. At least that's when it was prevalent in most of the country. Very few examples of federal style that I could find in Wellfleet. This is probably not the best, but they're taller, typically taller, 2 to 2.5 stories tall, side gabled in the same way that a cape is side gabled. Often though not very deep, sometimes only 1 room deep. Hard to tell with this one. It could be 1, maybe 2 rooms deep. 5 bays, just like a full cape. All the openings are symmetrically placed. The door surrounds became even more elaborate. This isn't a particularly good example of a federal door surround because it was altered in the 20th century. We start now to see paired chimneys rather than that single very large chimney centered on the roof ridge. And then the Greek Revival. And I think I said earlier that most of the houses, most of the old houses in Wellfleet reflect the Greek Revival style. The Greek Revival was based on ancient Greek precedents. It's temple front. So with the Greek Revival house, instead of the entry being on the long side of the house, the entry was on the gable end of the house. And this is a typical Greek temple form. It came in this country also to represent democratic ideals. So it's been called the democratic style. Characteristics of Greek Revival. Front gable temple form. That's 90% of the Greek Revival houses have this form, though some are side gabled. A deep cornice, you can see there's a rather deep overhang here on the cornice. 1 or 2 part frieze boards. So these are the frieze boards that touch the eaves, touch the cornice at the front, at the gable, and along the sides. And sometimes these frieze boards along the sides could become very tall and sometimes comprised 2 pieces of wood. They were 2-part. The corner boards that we saw on the Cape style houses have expanded now. So they're much wider. These are pilasters. They're no longer corner boards, they're pilasters. These have some decorative channeling that you can see to the left and right. Eave return, so this is an eave return. So that's where the cornice turns at the top of the corner pilaster. And you see this on every Greek Revival house. Wood clapboards, are you beginning to see maybe more generous use of clapboards or clapboards in combination with shingles? This actually, I think, is an all shingle house, although it's a little hard to tell in the picture. 6/6 window sash, 6 panes at the top or lights at the top sash and 6 at the bottom. Glass at this point had gotten a little cheaper, and America was starting to manufacture its own glass. And so that enabled the use of larger panes of glass in the windows. The door surrounds were actually not quite as elaborate as some of the ones that we've seen in the federal houses. You don't see elliptical transoms often. What you do see, which is sort of the definitive character-defining feature, of a Greek Revival door surround are these side lights. So in the Greek Revival, the side lights are full height. In other words, they extend from the top to the bottom of the door on both sides. During the earlier Federal style period, the side lights only extended halfway. So those are called half side lights or partial side lights. So that's always a good clue to the style of the house. The chimneys at this point became less conspicuous. That's because they weren't quite as essential. Houses began introducing heating systems. Some of them were rather primitive, but you started seeing wood stoves in the 1830s and 40s. So the chimneys became smaller and a little less conspicuous. The Gothic Revival, and this is one of those styles that I said had once been referred to as a picturesque style. The Gothic Revival draws on kind of medieval inspiration. Some of these houses are very fanciful, almost, storybook-like. They have very steep roofs and cross gables, usually asymmetrical, decorative barge boards. And these boards along the cornice, you see these lacy, incised decorative boards called barge boards or verge boards. Very important feature of the Gothic Revival. Also, elaborate porch brackets. The windows are a little narrower and often grouped together, so you can see a trio of windows here. Looks like a Palladian window, 3 windows here with sort of interesting door hoods or trim at the sill or at the lintels. 2/2 window sash. Now here's a contradiction because this is a Gothic Revival house, but it has 6/6 windows, which are really characteristic of an earlier period. Gothic Revival would typically have 2/2 or 2/1, and narrow chimneys and not very prominent chimneys. The Gothic Revival style in America was perpetuated and popularized by Arthur Downing, who did a series of pattern books that really popularized the Gothic Revival and the Italianate house. The Greek Revival that we just discussed was also disseminated broadly through pattern books. And the person most famously associated with those pattern books was the architect Asher Benjamin. So Italianate. I was hard pressed to find an intact example of an Italianate house in Wellfleet. There is one shown here at the lower left. It's off Holbrook. I actually was not able to see it in person, so I'm not sure what it looks like today, but this picture was drawn from one of the Wellfleet survey forms that was done in the 1980s. I don't know where this example comes from that I found, but it's got everything that an Italianate house should have. By definition, they have flat or shallow hipped roofs, very deep overhanging eaves, paired brackets at the cornice, and you can see these paired brackets. They almost always come in twos. A square cupola or tower, and we've got one here, also with brackets at the cornice. Narrow windows, often paired. We're not seeing paired windows here, but we're seeing very elaborately decorated windows. Typically a double door, and we have a paired double door here. It's an arched entry. And flat roof porches or porticos with decorative brackets, and you definitely see that there. This Wellfleet house demonstrates the Italianate style with its flat roof, with its tower, and with this door hood supported by brackets. The Second Empire. This example from Wellfleet dates to 1875. The Second Empire draws from the French, and it refers to Napoleon's Second Empire, or the general, it was called in this country often the General Grant style, because a lot of these houses were built in this style, both residence and public buildings during the presidency of General Grant. The single feature that defines a Second Empire house is the mansard roof. You have to have a mansard roof or you're not Second Empire. And they almost always have dormers, like the dormers that you see here. Just like the Italianate style, you see paired brackets along the cornice here at the roof cornice, and also on the porch roofs here and here. Paired entry doors, which this house doesn't have. Flat roof door hoods and porch roofs with decorative brackets. We'll see a lot more of them later. And bay windows. And then the shingle style. I think there's only one example of shingle style in Wellfleet, and this is it. The single thing that defines a shingle style house is it's all shingles. And they are continuous shingles without corner interruptions typically. Most shingle style houses are asymmetrical. This one is not. It does have cross gables, however, and kind of the beginnings of a tower here. Extensive porches. This looks to have an entirely, wraparound porch. Windows had typically multi-pane upper sash, hard to see here, and single pane lower sash. A lot of shingle style buildings, shingle style homes have a lot of curves. Eyebrow windows, we're not seeing them here. And the shingles just literally wrap the curves of the house. And then the colonial revival, which was the predominant residential and institutional style in the first half of the 20th century. The colonial revival was a throwback and incorporated Georgian, federal, and Greek revival trim details, all the classical details. But in the colonial revival, a lot of these details tended to be exaggerated, sometimes wildly over-exaggerated. We're not seeing that in either of these two buildings. On the top, from 1906, was an early post office in Wellfleet. It's got the dentals along the cornice line. It's got a hip roof. These dentals, and I failed to describe them before, but dentals are little decorative elements that look like little teeth that occur in rows along a cornice, very classical detail. They were used a lot in Greek architecture. This house below on Briar, built in 1925, a 20th century colonial revival house. You can see it's got the door surround with the half or the partial side lights. It's got an elliptical transom. The windows are 6/6, and you do see predominantly 6/6 windows in classical or colonial revival houses. And then mid-century modern. Wellfleet's claim to fame, as I mentioned earlier, there's a wonderful collection of mid-century modern homes in Wellfleet that were extremely well documented. There was a special project undertaken by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, I'm assuming in collaboration with the Wellfleet Historical Commission, and there are really valuable resources available with kind of deep research done into Wellfleet's mid-century modern houses. They were influenced by Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius, famous architect, identified with modernism and the international style. These were one story, often cantilevered, always had a flat roof, typically of wood, but some incorporate stucco, generally lots of glass. Large areas of blank wall, as you see here. Floor to ceiling windows, almost no ornament, emphasis on function. This particular one was built in 1945 in Wellfleet. And then we have our blends and updates. It's almost impossible in Wellfleet to find a house that's 100% pure that represents a single style. They just don't exist. And homeowners typically wanted to keep their houses in style. And so they would update them. They would replace the windows. They would replace the door surround with a more elegant and elaborate door surround. So here we have an example on the left, dates to 1850. Looks like probably started life as a Greek revival house. This portion of the house is Greek revival in detail. It's got a deep two-part frieze board, a deep cornice, It's got those characteristic eave returns, but then a lot of stuff was added to it. We got bay windows, 2 of them. We got a flat roof porch, another flat roofed addition in the back, and a tower. So the tower is an Italianate feature, but it's a tower with a mansard roof, which is a Second Empire feature. Second Empire and Italianate did share lots of features in common, including paired windows. On the right, we have another house built the same year, roughly. Very different, but also Greek Revival initially, and Greek Revival with probably a later wing. The Greek Revival pilasters at the side, the classic Greek Revival door surround with the full height side lights, 6/6 windows, but they added some decorative details, some Italianate details in the form of these paired brackets along the cornice. And then this addition kind of replicates the main entry, doesn't have side lights, but here we've got a really steep gabled or cross gable, which is distinctly Gothic Revival. There we go. The house on the left, 1870, Greek Revival, but it's got an Italianate treatment at the door. Original side lights, but we have a flat door hood with scroll brackets supporting it. And the arched window in the peak is typical of the later style. Here on the right, we have a very curious house. It's a curious but wonderful. Again, started as a very small 3/4 cape, 2 windows on one side, 1 on the other side of the door, chimney centered above the door. This was the original front of the house. It's now the back of the house, and all sorts of things were added to the front of the house. This particular house is on Baker Avenue. You can see the original cape here, and then you can see a bay. This is actually called an oriel. If a bay is added at the second floor, doesn't extend down to the first floor, it's an oriel. A flat roofed addition and many other additions, with the main entry of the house now being on this wall. Now we have some reinventions. This is a picture of the house that was on the 1980s survey form. It is a full cape. This portion of the house is now here. This, I think it's this wall, though it might be the other wall, now has an addition. So the main entry was moved around to the gable end. So it's been completely Greek revivalized, with the Greek Revival style entry added here, a second one here on the wing, pilasters, eave returns, 6/6 windows. These windows may have originally started as closet windows on the cape. I'm not sure. They were probably enlarged if they were. But so houses keep getting reinvented. This actually happened sometime between the early 1980s and today. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that I was involved in, the Historic Survey Project. So kind of a precept of historic preservation is that the first step in preserving anything is identifying it and documenting it. So this is a process to identify and document a community's historic resources. What constitutes a survey? Well, this is the academic definition that is provided by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, who's ultimately responsible for these surveys. So these survey forms, which are also called inventory forms or Form Bs, create an inventory of historic and archaeologic resources and form a repository of information about them. Most of these surveys are conducted by local historical commissions or professional historic survey consultants. What gets surveyed? Well, everything. Buildings, structures, objects, bridges, areas, parks, cemeteries, streetscapes, archaeologic sites, boats, anything that's considered an important object or structure. Typically, it's buildings more than 50 years old, or not always. Information is included on the location of the property, appearance, condition, history, and significance. So Wellfleet now is updating survey forms that were done in the 80s and documenting buildings that were overlooked. And when I refer to buildings that were overlooked, some of the buildings that were overlooked were buildings that were around in the 80s, but perhaps not considered as significant then. They might have been not particularly architecturally distinguished. They might have been working class residences, workmen's housing, tenements, that perhaps weren't considered to be particularly architecturally or historically significant at the time, but have proven to be very culturally significant. What are these forms used for? Well, there's a sort of a laundry list of purposes that they serve. I'll give you a few examples of, in Wellfleet, for instance, of how these surveys have proven useful. The surveys that were performed in the 1980s formed the basis for the National Register districts that Wellfleet now boasts. They help the Historical Commission determine which houses are appropriate to be reviewed if changes are considered. It also helps the Historical Commission determine how to implement demolition delay. Real estate agents use them a lot. People considering buying a house, new homeowners, are often very much interested to know when was the house built, and they want to know something about its history. Where are they kept? They are formally filed with the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and they're available online through a system called MACRIS. That's the Massachusetts Cultural Resources Information System. So if you go to this website and you type in Wellfleet, they'll come up. All the resources that have been inventoried are indexed by town, by neighborhood, and by street address. And they're searchable by resource type, by architectural style, what they're built of, what their architectural significance might be. So they're available there. There are also printed copies at the Wellfleet Public Library, and the Wellfleet Historical Society also has all of them in digital form. So this is the homepage for MACRIS, which I encourage you to visit. It's really fun to search the buildings in Wellfleet. This is an example of a form from the 1980s, and actually Helen Purcell did it. Helen's been mentioned before by Merrill. She, I know, died not too long ago, a beloved and important character in Wellfleet, and documenter of its history, but so much of the information that she gleaned that's reflected on this early forms is hugely helpful. So this is, I'm going to kind of walk you through the process here of how we go about documenting these houses. And I'm going to use this one as an example. This is on Cross Street and known historically as the Clement M. Higgins House. The forms contain all the information. And this is actually mandated by the Mass Historical Commission. And their requirements have changed over the years. They're pretty definitive about what they want on the forms. Here is the first page of a form on that same property. On the right, a photograph, a locus map with the property outlined. On the left here, page 2, a detailed architectural description of the house, and then an historical narrative that talks about the history of the house. The deed research that was performed is summarized. Who lived here? Now, as we continue, deed research on the upper left, we typically include a picture of the footprint of the house. This comes from the Wellfleet Assessors Database. We include the 1980s photograph. If the house was surveyed in the 1980s, we include that because it's very helpful in knowing how it may or may not have changed since then. And then these forms include more updated pictures of other elevations or sides of the house. The process starts with identifying the properties that you believe need to be documented, and that's always in conjunction with the client, with the Historical Commission. You visit the site, you take pictures, perform your deed research. We're able to do that online these days, which is really helpful. All the deeds are contained at the Barnstable County Registry. And then genealogical research, ancestry.com is where most of it comes from. Census research, maps, newspapers, secondary sources, local histories. You develop an architectural description based on the physical appearance of the house, then develop an historical narrative, complete the form. It's provided to the Wellfleet Historical Commission for review and proofing. And then it's submitted to MHC, the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and is posted on Macros. This is one of the resources that is tremendously helpful in researching houses, and typically where we start, that's with the assessor's card. And there is deed information right here, the most recent transfer histories, which will direct you to the book and page where the deed can be found, hopefully. This is an early deed dated to 1918 on this property, documenting one of the transfers. This is a chain of owners, starting with the first deed that I was able to find. You sometimes, not infrequently, hit dead ends when it comes to deed research. This shows the transfer of the property from Eliezer and Susanna Atwood to Clement Higgins, and Clement Higgins' name is associated historically with the house. Directories are helpful. This is a 1929 Wellfleet directory. And if Higgins was employed in a business, you might find an advertisement here. Bibliography and references, a number of local histories, including Simeon Deo's History of Barnstable County. There's several histories of Wellfleet that have been very valuable, and the series of Wellfleet Remembers booklets that probably most of you are familiar with. So we're just going to look at how this property appeared on maps. There are three really solid maps that we depend on for our research in Wellfleet. The first one is 1858 map. And here we see outlined the area on Cross Street where this house would appear. It's not on the 1858 map. Oh, I take that back. It is on the 1858 map because here it is, E.H. Atwood, who transferred it to Clement Higgins. This is the 1880 map. This is the area of the map. You can see that Wellfleet has grown considerably since 1858. And here we zero in on C. Higgins' house. And then the 1910 map. And here we see an example of an error on a map, which doesn't happen infrequently either, which is why it's good to really use a variety of sources when you're trying to pinpoint a house. But in this particular instance, the map makers reverse the names. So Young belongs on the Moore house and Moore belongs on the Young house. But this can trip you up. So now we're going to explore a collection of Wellfleet houses and the stories they tell. So we'll start with this one. This is known as Morning Glory. This is Second Empire in style. You can see defined by the mansard roof. It's a fascinating house. It appears on the 1880 map. This is on Holbrook, with H.A. Holbrook as the owner. Those of you who live in Wellfleet are familiar probably with Holbrook Avenue and with the history of the Holbrook family. The Holbrooks were one of Wellfleet's founding families. And in the mid-19th century, they owned a fair amount of property at the north end of Holbrook Avenue. There were several Holbrooks who lived there. They maintained the Holbrook Hotel. There was a Holbrook livery and stable, a Holbrook store. So the Holbrook estate, which owned this property initially before it was developed, sold it to France B. Hiller in the 1880s. And Hiller, who was a doctor, her husband was a doctor, the Hillers, pair of physicians, she supposedly moved a windmill from Mill Hill, which was nearby, to the site and incorporated it into the house. We are not 100% sure whether Hiller actually moved the windmill or not. We think probably the house, there was something on the property before she made a purchase in the early 80s, but the house continued to grow. And in the next slide, you can see the footprint of a house, which shows how very complex it was. Here's the tower. This piece of the house is right here. This is an historic image. You can see here and on the previous slide that this component of the house looks very much like a storefront. So we suspect that it probably was a storefront or a small store that may have been moved there at some point and incorporated into this structure. France was an interesting character. She married money. Her husband, the doctor, Dr. Henry Miller, had made a fortune selling Dr. Hiller's elixir, a cure-all. Both she and her husband were quite eccentric. I found an article in an 1889 newspaper that talked about the extraordinarily complicated and elaborate caskets that she and her husband Henry had custom designed for both of them for their demise. So she and Henry married in 1868 in London, but they honeymooned on Cape Cod. So we believe that's how they came to know Wellfleet. The couple had 23 children. Sadly, none of whom survived to adulthood. 14 of these were twins. After the death of her husband, Henry, France married her coachman. He was a French Canadian. His name was Surette. He was half her age. When they married, she asked him to change his name to Henry Hiller, which he did. So he, through an act of the Massachusetts State Legislature, changed his name to Henry Hiller. Quite curious. Anyway, she and both of her husbands lived in Wilmington, Massachusetts, where they were quite the local celebrities, but they summered in Wellfleet. This was their summer home. France sold the house to Lorenzo Del Baker in 1898. We talked about Baker before and how many properties he owned. I think I probably failed to mention, or perhaps I did, but what a philanthropist he was and kind-hearted. But sometimes if he knew someone was in need, he would purchase a house, allow them to live in it, and it was theirs as long as they were able to maintain it themselves. So he purchased this house. We doubt very much whether he or if he ever lived here. It was then occupied later, inherited by his son, Joshua H. Baker, after his death. We think that the name Morning Glory was mentioned in the deed transfer from Francis Hiller to Lorenzo Del Baker. We think perhaps that referred to, we're not sure, but referred to the fact that this house has a wonderful location on a hill, on a high point of Holbrook Avenue overlooking the Wellfleet Harbor, and probably afforded from the back of the house really spectacular views of the sunrise in the morning. This is Arbutus. This is a cottage at the corner of Holbrook and Baker Avenue. It's not on the 1858 or the 1880 maps, but it does appear on the 1910 map, and it was owned by Mrs. Betsy Harriman. She was the widow of Hiram Putnam Harriman. And here's a picture of Hiram on the left, very successful attorney. He was a lawyer who had practices in Boston and on Cape Cod. He actually maintained his Cape Cod office right across the street at a house that's still there at the other corner of Baker Avenue and Holbrook. In 1882, he was appointed a judge of the probate and insolvency courts for Barnstable, Suffolk, and Norfolk counties. He later resigned his judgeship to concentrate on his law practice. And he was really well known for his defense work in very high profile criminal cases. And he was also legal counsel for some of the largest railroads in Massachusetts. So his family lived they had a house in Brookline. The family lived primarily in Brookline, but went back and forth between Brookline and Wellfleet, spent summers in Wellfleet. And again, he operated his Wellfleet law practice from the house across the street. Arbutus, and that term derives from a species of evergreen, was a summer cottage. There was a mistaken belief that's mentioned in some Wellfleet histories that the cottage was actually moved to the site from the Methodist camp. So these church camps were very popular in the 19th century. There was a very famous Methodist camp in Wellfleet, in Yarmouth. In fact, it's still there. And the Harrimans were very active participants and members of the Methodist camp in Yarmouth. I have an example in the upper right-hand corner of a typical Yarmouth Methodist church camp cottage. They were tiny. They were typically 10 feet wide by 17 feet long. The Harrimans did own a cottage in Yarmouth at the camp, and they named it Bidawee. It was built in 1879, but there is no evidence that they actually moved a cottage to the site. I'm going to go back, and here are some pictures of the Harrimans and their friends enjoying this gorgeous cottage, which is Gothic revival in style that we talked about before. Steep gables, cross gables, this intricate lacy verge boards at the eaves, very deep eave overhangs, decorative corner posts, brackets on the corner posts, really lovely. This house was actually built new by the Harrimans. In fact, it was mentioned in a newspaper article in 1897. The Yarmouth Register stated that Judge H.P. Harriman spent a few days at his new and attractive cottage on Holbrook Avenue. So I think that this was intentionally built to mimic or pay homage to the little cottages at the church camp. But it was built on a very prominent corner, and it's got two principal elevations, two main entries. They are mirror images of each other. So I think it was designed very specifically to occupy this prominent site. This is a house on East Commercial Street. And this was the first recorded owner of the property was Timothy Atwood Daniels, as in Uncle Tim's Bridge. Timothy Daniels went to sea, later became a retail grocer, but the Uncle Tim's Bridge, which was first constructed in 1844, was named after him. The property went to his son-in-law on his death, Washington Franklin Pierce, who then built the house with his wife, Mary Ann, around 1865, probably a few years after they were married. A Greek Revival house. Eve returns, but you can see it's got an updated entry. It's got that Italianate style flat hood over the front door. It's got elaborate scroll brackets supporting this roof, and it's got a double entry door. So there's a good story attached to later owners of this house. It was sold in 1928 to Henry W. and Cecilia Rapp. Henry Rapp was the son of German immigrants, and he had moved to Wellfleet in 1908, where he first bought a property on the bluff, a cottage at Pleasant Point in South Wellfleet. He owned a Boston company that specialized in speedboats, gas engine and fast boats. And so he had a boat that he and his wife traveled in back and forth between Wellfleet and Boston, across the Cape Cod Bay to and from Boston. In 1918, and this is while Rapp was still living in the first house, a neighbor of his in South Wellfleet reported him to the FBI, implicating him as a German spy. There was a lot of fear on the Cape at the time because there had been a tug and barge attack off Orleans by a German U-boat. So the neighbor was suspicious of Rapp, probably because of his German heritage. maybe a bit of jealousy because RAP was extremely successful financially. The neighbor suggested that RAP had been engaged in alleged suspicious activities and allegedly, made some pro-German statements. So the FBI investigated, but nothing came of it. He sold the property in South Wellfleet and purchased this house in 1928 and became a very respected leader of the community. So the Rapps went to Florida often in the summertime, and Cecilia was there in the winter of 1933 when an attempt was made to assassinate President-elect Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin happened to be in Miami at the time. Cecilia was staying in the same hotel, and a gunman fired 5 shots at Franklin Roosevelt, missed them all, but she was standing, as luck would have it, right beside the gunman and was temporarily blinded by the fire, the gunfire. The assassin was thrown to the floor immediately by bystanders and landed apparently nearly on her feet. So it had a happy ending for all. This house on Kendrick, right off the harbor, right at Mayo Beach, is the lightkeeper's house. A lighthouse was built in this location first in 1837. And there's a picture of the early lighthouse here in the bottom left. The lighthouse itself was actually incorporated within the structure of the house. This lighthouse replaced that. It was built in 1880. You can see another Gothic revival house like Arbutus, the cottage that we looked at. Decorative birch boards, asymmetrical, lots of decoration, actually even more elaborate on the back of the house than on the front. So this was for the lighthouse keeper. This was built in 1880. The first keeper of this Mayo Beach light was William Newcomb Atwood. Atwood had lost an arm in the Civil War, and in 1865 he was appointed lighthouse keeper in consideration of the sacrifice to his country. So he served as lightkeeper until his death when his wife took over, Sarah. She took over as principal lightkeeper in 1876, and here's her picture on the left. She earned an annual salary of $500 and was able to occupy the house with her family. According to the U.S. Coast Guard Historian's Office, positions as lighthouse keepers were among the first non-clerical U.S. government jobs that were open to women. So this 1880 structure was, this structure was dismantled. Well, in 1880, as you can see on the right, the lighthouse wasn't physically attached to the house, but it was adjacent to the house. This lighthouse was eventually dismantled. I don't know when that happened, but it was relocated to California, to the coast of California, and still occupies a site on the ocean there. In 1880, along with the construction of the house, this brick shed was built to store the kerosene that was used to power the light. The land and the house were sold at auction in 1923 to a captain. Typically in Wellfleet, captain was a nickname for, they were all sea captains, or at one point in their life, they'd served on the sea. This particular captain, however, Harry Capron, who purchased the house in 1923, was an automobile dealer. So go figure. This blacksmith shop on East Commercial Street, we think was built around 1850. There's sort of a mystery associated with the origins of this blacksmith shop. It's not on the 1858 map. There are no buildings shown here on the property. It's identified, but there are no buildings there in the 1880 map. And by the 1910 map, there are 2 little structures, wooden structures. They're outbuildings. Neither of them appears to represent a blacksmith shop. However, the property has been known historically as the Grant Blacksmith Shop, purported to be owned and operated by Melville Grant. But map, deed, and census research shows that Grant's blacksmith shop was not here. It was over here on Mayo Beach. And it comes up on the map right there. By 1900, Grant had left Wellfleet and was living in Brookline, and he was working as a fish salesman. In July of that year, he deeded the Mayo Beach property to, of all people, Lorenzo Del Baker. The 1910 map shows another blacksmith shop on Commercial Street, west of Bank Street, and I think it's labeled the Nye Blacksmith Shop. There's a possibility that that Nye Blacksmith Shop may have been relocated to the current site that we're looking at. Now, this is an early photograph of the location, and you can see just to the left of this arrow, what looks like could be a blacksmith shop or some sort of a foundry. It's got a very large chimney, but obviously not the blacksmith shop that's there now. Now, this shop sits on a concrete slab, that's a pretty good hint that this was moved here, probably in the 1920s, and perhaps it was the Nye blacksmith shop moved to, or perhaps it came from somewhere else, and has since been expanded greatly. This whole addition here, which is meant to kind of suggest a stable, was added in the 20th century. In 1953, this property was acquired by Henry B. and Dorothy Watson. Dorothy was a vintage jewelry collector and an art dealer, and she opened a gallery that year in the building called the Golden Cod. And this was the first gallery in Wellfleet devoted exclusively to the fine arts. The Creek House, this is on East Commercial Street. This is a curious house in that it kind of has two facades. This is the way it looks today. This was originally a 3/4 cape, but the openings have been shifted. So originally the door would have been right here in alignment with, this looks like the original position of the chimney right over what would have been a door, but it's been moved. It's got closet windows here, suggesting that it's on the early side as far as capes are concerned. But it's built into the bank, very steeply into the bank, and overlooks Duck Creek right over here. This is a view from across Uncle Tim's Bridge of the house. And you can see it's got rather elaborate detailing. It's got federal style detailing on this side of the house. That also reads nicely on this older photograph. So again, this gable end of the house here is the same as what we see here. So it had sort of a facelift. The lower level of this house one time served as Wellfleet's post office. The upper level was rented out. So local apocrypha suggests that at one time the house was owned by Julian Barr. Julian Barr was the steward and cook at the Marconi wireless station. However, the deed research shows that Barr never owned the house, so he probably occupied it as a tenant. And we know that there were that upper space was rented out to tenants for a long period of time. The property was sold in 1966 to William and Helen Purcell. The Purcells also owned more than one property, more than one historic property in Wellfleet. And Meryl's also already told you about Helen Purcell's importance to the town. This is a complex on Main Street. It called the Holiday House Complex, more recently Duck Creek Inn, most recently the Wagner at Duck Creek. So this was the first building on the site right here, the Holbrook House, which currently serves as an inn. This was built around 1810. This is the federal style building that we looked at earlier. It was built in 1810. The deed research shows that by 1842, it was a double house. It was jointly owned by Holbrook's sons, Benjamin Jr. and Giles Holbrook. And the deed describes how the house was divided, which was really interesting, that the brothers' families and their families shared it. So Benjamin was given the privilege to use the front and back stairs, all the bedrooms and the chamber, the western half of the buttery, the northern half of the cellar, and passage from the cellar to the exterior. He had no privilege in or out of any east porch door. Supposedly, Giles then had access to what was left of the house. Again, in 1858, it shows that the house is again jointly owned, but this time by Benjamin Holbrook Jr. and Jeremiah Hawes. And there is a pond just beyond and to the rear, quite a large pond beyond and behind this inn that's still called the Hawes Pond, and that derives from the part ownership of the house by Jeremiah Hawes. In 1920, in 1910, the house was acquired by Lorenzo Del Baker, sold in 1920. And at this point, the property was quite extensive and included 10 parcels. It was sold to Louisa T. Price of Wayne, Pennsylvania, and she later transferred it to her son and daughter. This is her son, F. Eulalia Price, who was married to Joseph Price. They lived in Pennsylvania and moved to Wellfleet, and they developed this whole property as really a resort. Here are some old images, some postcards advertising the holiday house. And they got busy expanding and renovating and building. This stable, which was moved from elsewhere on the property to a little closer to Main Street, was repurposed for residential use and used mostly by staff of the holiday house for lodging. The Higgins house was a discrete house built around 1860, right next door to the Holbrook house. Joseph Price, Eulalia's husband, was very clever. He was a carpenter and very good at assembling buildings from salvage. And so there's a Greek Revival house hiding under here, but it's got lots of accretions, including this one-story structure in front, several wings. And this was the tavern, served as the tavern for most of the life of the holiday house and the subsequent resorts that took over. The Hodgepodge house, built in 1935, completely assembled from salvaged pieces of other houses. And then the Saltworks, which he constructed in 1939, a colonial revival rendition of an earlier colonial house. In World War II, this whole complex was used briefly for housing military personnel associated with bases in Wellfleet and Truro. So after the death of Eulalia, her husband died first in 1971. The property was owned and operated by her friend, Virginia Crossman, for about 10 years, and then sold to a realty company. It was foreclosed upon eventually in 1979, and the town became briefly interested in purchasing the property and rehabilitating it. They considered making the inn a town hall and building a fire station on the property, but this never materialized. The property was sold and continued to operate as an inn and complex, which I think it still is today, although I do understand that the property is on the market. Ryder Court. And I see that I've been talking too long. It's 20 after 8. So I apologize. I'm going to just skip the next two and go to this one only because I think it's sort of an interesting but rather sad story associated with this. This was a store. It was constructed for Albert Holbrook and used continuously as a retail store since then. It was moved, we think, to the property and operated as a store, first by Albert Holbrook and then by G.C. Williams and Company as a grocery store. Sold to Mary and James Rich in 1902. The Riches operated a grocery store here and an ice cream parlor up the street that was known as Uncle Jim's Ice Cream Parlor, later to become known as the Lighthouse Restaurant and then the Ship's Bell Inn. A tragedy happened here in 1913. So the Riches owned this and they owned the ice cream parlor up the street. They lived here above the grocery store and operated the ice cream parlor. their daughter, they had two children, Agnes and Solon. Agnes, pictured here, was working as a night operator in the telephone office that occupied the space above the ice cream parlor. She was living, however, with her parents here above the store. She was married but divorced from a George, AKA Chick Gardinier. Chick, they divorced. He ended up in jail. We're not sure exactly what his offense was, but he returned to Wellfleet after a period away, tried to persuade his ex-wife to return to him. She refused, and in August 1913, there was a murder-suicide. He killed his wife and himself above the grocery store. So Agnes's brother, Solon, became the guardian of her son, Lawrence Gardinier, and Lawrence actually became a very well-known civic leader in Boston. He was a police chief. He actually was an inventor, and he fabricated the clock at the First Congregational Church, claimed to be the only town clock in the country that operates on ship's time and uses a ship's bell to toll the time. This is the annex to the Wellfleet Hotel, which we see on the left. And I feel that I overstayed my welcome. So if anyone wants to stay on afterwards, I'm happy to talk a little more about these houses. All interesting, but I feel like I need to pause here and see if we have any questions.
Why don't you stop sharing your screen so we could have a
I will.
yeah. Milton has a question.
Yes.
Yeah. I saw a glimpse of my house at the end and we didn't get to talk about it.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
The arbutus,
Yes.
it belongs to the Arms family.
Okay.
The late Mrs. Arms was Betsy Harriman, and they told me the story of bringing it from
The
camp.
yes.
So I wonder if maybe half of it came from the campsite and the other half was added to it.
That's possible.
They
possible.
really thought that was the history of the house.
It looks like more research is merited here.
Well, the Arms sons still own it, so.
Yeah. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
And it's an incredible cottage. I love it. And you're in the Curran, the horse barn, correct?
Right.
Which
well,
we just blew through.
Yeah.
Somebody direct messaged me that they would love to know more about what used to be the Jules Besh business across from the Blue Heron Gallery.
I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that. There might be someone on the Historical Commission who does.
It was a bank.
Yeah, I don't think it was on my list.
It was the Cape Cod 5-cent savings bank. I remember going there and opening an account there, the first account I ever had in Wellfleet.
Huh.
Which is now, of course, Cape Cod 5.
That's good to know. I saw in the chat someone had a question about salt box houses. I'm sure there's a salt box or two in Wellfleet. I didn't encounter one in the work that I did. They tended to be quite early and have this characteristic salt box shape, which oftentimes was a Cape style house with a kitchen shed added along the rear elevation and then ultimately incorporated into the back of the house, which created that distinctive roof line at the back of the house.
Do you know anything about the moorings on Commercial Street?
The moorings on Commercial Street. Associated with a building, or?
That's all I have.
Sorry.
How about do you have information on 130 School Street?
I did not. I
It's
only
okay,
did-
I'm not, these, you know,
No,
people,
no.
yeah.
I can't picture it.
And there are at least 2 bowed roof houses in Wellfleet.
Great.
Yeah. Any old brick buildings?
Yes, some old brick buildings. None that I worked on. And again, I have only done part of the inventory for Wellfleet. Other consultants have been involved. So if you go to Macris, you can see, you might be able to find some background on the houses that I didn't survey and that we didn't touch on today.
Right.
Oh, no.
Somebody asked about the library, which, you know, was like a little softball to me there, but I don't know if we can talk about that. Which was converted from a candle factory in the 80s.
Yes, I remember reading about that. And that reminds me of, so the bookstore on, is it Heron's bookstore?
Marriage.
Harrods, thank you. Yes, that is one of the houses that I researched. And I remember it was owned by a husband and wife, the Handys, I think. He had a plumbing business and she operated a taxi. This was in the 1930s. I think this is recounted in one of the Wellfleet Remembers books, but she used to chauffeur workers back and forth. She would take them to work at the candle factory. I remember reading.
Wow. Any other questions? Prior to being a candle factory, it was a curtain factory, yes.
Oh, right.
The moorings was owned at one time, these are growing so quickly, by Captain George Higgins. Mrs. Fricker of the Holden Inn was related to him. The shed roof houses built by Luther Crowell in the 1950s, are they found elsewhere?
I'm sorry, the shed roof.
Houses built by Luther Crowell in the
Oh,
1950s, are they found elsewhere?
I'm not familiar with those.
Okay. Would love to know more about homes outside of town center, some great historic properties on the other side of Route 6, right up to the Truro line.
Mhm. And I did research one. It's a 3/4 cape, part of a what's it called? Expanded into a small condominium. There's a group of there's the original house, and then there are some smaller, newer cottages around it. That's quite a stunning house. I actually think that was one of the houses that had a bow roof.
Here's a great question. This person wants to know what is the best place to find historical documents on these homes?
Lots of sources, though actually, if it's been surveyed, if an updated survey form exists, that's a good place to start. And again, these are all found on Macris, printed copies at the library or soon to be at the library, and digital copies at the Historical Society. other resources, you know, local histories. There's several local histories of Wellfleet. Deed research, you know, kind of the same sources that I used in my research. Maps, also available. The 1858, the 1880, and the 1910 maps are all, I'm quite sure, available at the Historical Society, but also can be found online. The Wellfleet Historical Society also has a wonderful blog that focuses particularly on South Wellfleet, but that was a terrific resource for me too.
Meryl, did you want to say something?
No, the question was answered.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Did you look at any of the buildings, Cape Cod style in the 1950s in the National Seashore off of Ocean View Drive in South Wellfleet?
No.
Okay. I would love to know where L.D. Baker lived in town before building Belvernon.
And Belvernon is that's a great story. And that's a fascinating house. I did not research that house, but it's been well documented. He owns so many properties in Wellfleet. Yes, that would be something that would be really interesting to delve into.
How about Cannon Hill area? Understand there were quite a few B&Bs as it was the last stop on the Cape Cod Railroad.
Also not familiar with that area. I'm sorry. There's many people here who probably know a great deal more about this than I do. I really, you know, I'm restricted to understanding of the 142 properties, specific properties that I researched.
Someone wants more information on mid-century modern houses, which could be its own presentation.
Right.
There's obviously the Cape Cod Modern House Trust, which has information on that, as well as, you know, we have the Cape Cod Modern, which is like the book about that at the library. We have several copies of that.
Yes, that's a wonderful book. And the I had mentioned that the Wellfleet mid-century modern houses were quite well documented a few years ago. And all those, that work is also all available on MACRIS, on the Mass Historical Commission's website.
What about the Lighthouse Restaurant on Main Street?
Yes, that was one that I sort of skipped through because we had run out of time, but let me look for my notes on that. Okay, so also a building that had been moved, supposedly from Great Island, moved to Main Street. Main floor was used as a post office in the 1890s. And then this was acquired by the Riches, who I mentioned before, Mary and James Rich, whose daughter sadly lost her life. The upper floor served as lodging. There was a dentist's office there, a telephone office. James' son Solon was a telephone repairman, and he tested the Western Union wires there for the first time in that office on the second floor in 1915. Transferred to their grandson, Lawrence Gardinier. So he ran the ice cream shop, but he was also an engineer, an artist, and an inventor. He was a selectman, the police chief, I mentioned that. Best remembered for fabricating the town clock. Then after 1936, Uncle Jim's became the Ship's Bell Restaurant, and later the Lighthouse Restaurant. And I guess the restaurant closed in 2019, and the Cape Cod Times said, Main Street is missing a tooth. You really notice it's not there anymore, but the lighthouse is still there.
What about the Pine Point area? Did you do any research around that area?
I did a couple houses on Pine Point. One of them I used as a slide when I started to talk about architectural styles. It's the one at the point, at the very point a beautiful full cape, kind of out there by itself, had blue shutters. I think Helen Purcell might have owned, she and her husband might have owned that property at one time too.
Mhm.
I can add to that. They did own that property at one time.
Mhm.
And the Pine Point area used to be known as Physic Point because there was a physician who lived in that house. And he used to do house calls across Uncle Tim's Bridge.
Mhm.
And I guess the other thing about that area is that many of the buildings in the Pine Point area are expected to have been floated over from Billingsgate when Billingsgate was inundated.
Yes. And lots of houses were moved. Lots of houses were moved at the time all across the country. We're talking kind of mid-19th century because it was cheaper than building, cheaper than new construction. Lumber was expensive. So they recycled houses and buildings all the time. A lot of houses in Wellfleet in particular got moved inland because they were on islands and they were being inundated, by the encroaching ocean. So they were moving to higher, safer land. Some of them were floated, some of them were rolled on log rollers. Some of them were cut in half and transported in two pieces and then reassembled. There's one of those houses on Payne Hollow that I saw. And you can actually, if you look at the gable end of the house, you can see where all the clapboards were cut and then pieced back together, right down the middle of the gable.
Do you know anything about the Biddle property?
I do not.
And what is the oldest home or area in Wellfleet?
The oldest area, the oldest houses would be, and again, I don't know where they all are, but they would be certainly, I should think outlying, not along the, in the commercial center of Wellfleet.
I can add to that. The oldest house in Wellfleet, according to the Library of Congress data, is the Atwood Higgins House on Bound Brook. And the Baker Biddle House is close to that as well. That also is documented in the Library of Congress. But there are several old neighborhoods. Bound Brook is one of them. And that's the one where most of the houses are preserved, although many of the houses on Bound Brook were floated over. Many are reputed to be on Holbrook.
All right. Well, that seems to be everything in the chat. Everything else seems to be that people want you to continue with the slides that you didn't get to.
However, I'm realizing that we said this would end at 8:30. And Lynn's been very generous with her time. So I love the enthusiasm about this talk. And I so appreciate that all of you have attended and that there's so much interest. And we will definitely look into doing this again. Maybe we can bring Lynn back.
Thank you so much. I apologize again for not, gauging how long this would take.
Lynn, it was terrific. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was
Thank you.
really, really interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And we really appreciate all of the work that you put into it. And the slides were great.
Well, thank you so much. It's my pleasure. And I hope to stick around.
We hope you will too.
Spend time in Wellfleet.
I would put this recording onto a YouTube link, and I will circulate it so that people will have it. It will also go up on our library's website, but I'll make sure that the Historical Society and the Historical Commission both have it as well. So you
Great.
can all access it.
Thanks again, Jennifer.
Absolutely.
Appreciate your help.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Lynn.
Jennifer. Yeah.
Okay.
And thanks for saving me at the beginning.
Good teamwork. Good teamwork.
Yay.
Yeah.
The best kind.
Thank you all.
All right.
Good night.
Good
Good night.
night.
Good night.
Take care.